designated area, and it's going to be
This is really
125,000
planes. And he just strolled.
Men fight over a plane contract worth
seriously rethinking the F-35 fighter jet deal, a purchase that ranks among the largest military acquisitions in the entire history of the country. And the single biggest reason behind that hesitation is not a budget problem, not a technical fault in the aircraft, and not some sudden change of heart from the Canadian public. The reason is Washington itself. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has opened a review of this agreement at the exact moment the Pentagon is publicly pressing Ottawa to sign, seal, and finalize the order without any more delay. That friction, playing out between two neighbors who have spent decades treating each other's security as a single shared project, is what I want to walk you through today, because it reveals far more about where this relationship is heading than any single announcement ever could. Let me set the scene properly, because the details here matter. Canada committed to buying a fleet of F-35 fighter jets as the backbone of its future air power.
That America wants to break us so America can own us. And that will never, ever happen. That is how our neighbor to the north describes us now.
This was meant to be one of those decisions that quietly locks in the next 30 or 40 years of a country's defense posture. You buy the jet, and along with it, you buy the software, the maintenance ecosystem, the training pipelines, the spare parts, the upgrade path, and the deep operational relationship with the country that builds and controls all of it. In this case, that country is the United States.
It's a completely self-run unit. You can attach it to any weapon system, any existing weapon system that you have. It has a high-powered laser, a laser rangefinder here, and then a target.
So when I say Canada is reviewing the deal, I am not describing a small procurement adjustment. I am describing a country pausing to ask whether it wants to renew, at full strength, the deepest thread of dependence it has on its southern neighbor. And that is exactly why the Pentagon reacted the way it did. American defense officials have not been quiet about their frustration. They have openly framed the Canadian delays as a case of, in their words, politics being placed over the shared responsibility both countries carry for the defense of North America. That is unusually direct language for two allies who normally keep their disagreements behind closed doors. When one partner publicly accuses the other of dragging its feet on something as fundamental as continental defense, you are no longer watching a routine negotiation. You are watching a standoff. And this particular standoff sits inside a much larger disagreement between Ottawa and Washington that has been building for some time. Here is the strategic heart of it, and I want you to hold on to this idea because everything else flows from it. A fighter jet purchase is never just about hardware. It is never just about how fast the plane flies or how many missiles it can carry. When a country buys an advanced aircraft like the F-35, it is signing up for a decades-long relationship with the manufacturer and, more importantly, with the government that stands behind that manufacturer. The systems inside the jet, the software that runs it, the mission data that tells it how to operate in a real conflict, the updates that keep it capable against new threats, all of that flows through American channels. So the aircraft is not a product you buy once and own outright. It is an ongoing dependency. And Canada, more than almost any other buyer, has historically been comfortable with that dependency, because for generations, Ottawa simply assumed that its security and Washington's security were one and the same. That assumption is what appears to be shifting now. Prime Minister Carney came into office with a clear message about reducing Canada's reliance on the United States. At first, a lot of people read that as an economic and trade posture, a response to tensions over tariffs and commerce. But what we are seeing now is that this pledge is bleeding into the military domain, and that is a much bigger deal. For most of modern history, when it came to defense, Canada deferred to Washington almost automatically. The two militaries plan together, train together, and in many respects operate as a single integrated system for defending the continent. So for Ottawa to even reopen a question like the F-35 order is a signal that the desire for greater independence is no longer just talk about trade. It is reaching into the one area where Canada has been most tightly bound to its neighbor. Now, I want to be fair about the stakes here, because this cuts both ways, and it is not as simple as Canada wanting freedom and the United States wanting control. The Americans have real reasons to want this order locked in. From Washington's point of view, an integrated continental defense only works if both partners are fully committed to the same equipment, the same standards, and the same long-term planning.
Term began. And as I've covered here plenty, instead of squabbling with their annoying neighbor to the south, Canada is actually thriving. They're having
A wavering Canada complicates everything, from logistics to interoperability to the basic confidence that both countries will show up with compatible systems when it counts. And the United States has not been shy about using leverage to push Ottawa back toward commitment. That leverage has a name, and it is worth understanding. The United States has tied Canada's role in a major missile defense initiative, known as the Golden Dome Project, to Canadian cooperation on these broader defense questions. Golden Dome is envisioned as a large, ambitious shield designed to protect North America from advanced missile threats. For Canada, being inside that project means being part of the future architecture of continental defense, having a seat at the table where the most important decisions get made, and securing industrial and technological benefits for Canadian companies. Being left outside of it would mean the opposite, watching from the sidelines while the defense of your own continent gets designed without you. So when Washington links the fighter jet order and the broader relationship to participation in Golden Dome, it is applying pressure on something Canada genuinely values. It is essentially saying that cooperation in one area buys access in another. At the same time, Ottawa is weighing a very different set of considerations. On the Canadian side of the ledger, this is about cost, about sovereignty, and about industrial benefit. Cost is straightforward. A fighter program of this size runs into enormous sums of money spread across decades, and any government has to ask whether that money is being spent in the smartest possible way. Sovereignty is more subtle, but arguably more important. If your most advanced military hardware depends entirely on another country's software, support, and goodwill, then in a very real sense, that country holds influence over your ability to act independently. And industrial benefit is the practical question of what Canada actually gets in return. How many Canadian jobs? How much Canadian technology? How much of the work stays inside the country rather than flowing south? These are the trade-offs Carney's government is now openly weighing, sticking with the full F-35 commitment on one hand or hedging its bets on the other. I want to slow down on that industrial benefit question for a moment, because it often gets treated as an afterthought when it is actually one of the most powerful drivers of the whole debate.
I heard a lot about how the world had changed.
Because we're just in a very different world than we were just 24 months ago.
Yeah, it's not that the...
When a country spends an enormous sum on a fighter program, its government wants more than just the aircraft in return. It wants a share of the work. It wants factories inside its own borders building components, engineers on its own soil developing the technology, and long-term maintenance contracts that keep skilled jobs at home, rather than sending all of that value abroad. For Canada, the promise of that kind of domestic benefit is a huge part of what justifies the price tag to voters and to the industries that stand to gain. So when Ottawa reviews the deal, it is not only asking whether the jet is the right jet, it is asking whether Canada is getting enough back, whether the balance of benefits tilts fairly toward Canadian workers and Canadian companies, or whether too much of the value flows south. That calculation feeds directly into the sovereignty argument, because economic dependence and military dependence tend to reinforce each other. A country that builds part of its own defense industry is a country with more room to say no. And the friction has already produced concrete consequences, not just harsh words. One of the most telling signs of how far this has gone is that the Pentagon paused a binational defense planning board, one of the very mechanisms that exists specifically so that the two countries can coordinate their defense planning together. Think about what that means for a moment. These planning bodies are the quiet machinery of the alliance. They are where officials from both sides sit down and map out how they will defend the continent as a unit. When one side hits pause on that machinery, it is not a symbolic gesture.
Like an ex who finally went to therapy and figured out exactly what was going on the whole time. We've spent over a century trying to earn the trust of...
It is a real disruption to the day-to-day cooperation that both countries have relied on for generations. It tells you that the disagreement over the fighter jets is not sealed off in its own little box. It is rippling outward and touching the foundations of how the two militaries work together. So let me pull back and give you the wider picture of what is really happening here, because I think it is easy to get lost in the specifics of one aircraft order. What we are watching is a moment where the oldest and deepest assumptions of the Canada and United States defense relationship are being tested. For as long as most people can remember, the arrangement was simple and stable. Canada would align its equipment and its planning with the United States. The two would defend North America together through shared institutions, and neither side would seriously question the setup. That stability was almost a law of nature in the security world. And now, quietly but unmistakably, one side is questioning it. I want to spend a moment on why the F-35 in particular is such a symbolic flashpoint, because the choice of this program as the battleground is not an accident.
Show here, we're very much moving to our robots fighting their robots and trying to keep people out of it. And so for me, I guess that's a good thing, we're keeping people safe, and what happens.
The fighter jet sits at the very core of a nation's air defense. It is the tool a country reaches for when it needs to police its own skies, respond to intrusions, and project the ability to protect its territory. In the shared North American defense system, Canadian and American aircraft operate under a joint command structure that has, for decades, treated the skies over the continent as one indivisible space to be defended together.
So how did these Canadian rifles get to Sudan and Libya? We have one more set of clues to dig into on Instagram and YouTube, where Sterling Cross rifles are advertised and...
Canada's fighters are not just Canadian assets, they are pieces of a combined system. So the aircraft Canada chooses, and the country it chooses to depend on for that aircraft, is not a narrow procurement question. It goes to the heart of how integrated the two countries remain. That is why reopening the F-35 decision carries so much weight. If Canada were reconsidering some minor piece of equipment, the Americans would barely blink.
The rapid support forces, whether also the stakeholders in Yemen, whether that's in Libya, the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, all of these are non-state armed.
But the fighter fleet is the crown jewel of interoperability. It is the clearest, most visible expression of how tightly the two air forces are woven together. To question it is to question the whole fabric, and I suspect that is exactly why the Pentagon's response has been so pointed. Washington understands the symbolism. It knows that if Canada is willing to reopen this, then nothing in the relationship is truly off the table anymore. Let me also give Canada's position the seriousness it deserves, because it would be a mistake to treat this as Ottawa simply being difficult. From the Canadian perspective, there is a genuine and reasonable argument that a country should not have every layer of its most critical defense capability locked into a single foreign supplier. Dependence is comfortable right up until the moment the relationship gets complicated, and recent tensions have shown Ottawa just how uncomfortable that dependence can become when the two governments are not seeing eye to eye.
It's their weapons, hopefully never to have to use them, but for the credible show of force. So we do.
When I talked to people at CanSec about why they thought this increase in defense spending was so important.
When the country you rely on for your fighter jets is also the country you are quarreling with over trade and other matters, the wisdom of putting all of your eggs in one basket suddenly looks a lot less obvious. So Carney's government is doing what many strategists would call basic prudence. It is asking whether some hedging, some diversification, some reduction of that total reliance might leave Canada in a stronger and more independent position over the long run. But, and this is a big but, hedging comes with its own serious costs, and I do not want to paint this as a simple choice with an obvious right answer. If Canada trims, delays, or diversifies its fighter fleet, it does not just save some money and gain some independence. It also risks creating gaps and complications in the joint defense system it shares with the United States. A mixed fleet, with different aircraft from different suppliers, is harder and more expensive to maintain and operate. Reducing the order could leave Canada with fewer capable jets at a time when the security environment is anything but calm. And delaying decisions has a way of dragging on, leaving the Air Force in limbo while the aging equipment it flies gets older and less capable. So the very independence Ottawa is reaching for could come at the price of readiness, efficiency, and smooth cooperation with its most important ally. That is the knot Carney's government has to untangle. This is really the central tension of the whole story. On one side, you have the pull toward independence, the desire to control your own defense destiny, to reduce reliance on a neighbor whose reliability suddenly feels less certain, and to make sure Canadian money and Canadian industry get their fair share of the benefits. On the other side, you have the enormous weight of an integrated system that has worked, more or less, for generations, the practical advantages of shared equipment and shared planning, and the risk that pulling on one thread could unravel far more than intended.
Conflict more likely to occur. It increases the severity of conflict. It typically makes conflict last longer. All of these negative aspects typically being...
Neither side of that tension is obviously wrong. Both reflect legitimate priorities, and that is precisely why this decision is so hard, and why it has become such a public fight. Now let me turn to what I am watching for as this unfolds, because the outcome here is genuinely open, and the direction Canada chooses will send signals well beyond a single aircraft program. The first thing to watch is whether Canada trims the order, meaning it buys fewer of the jets than originally planned. That would be a middle path, keeping the aircraft but reducing the scale of the commitment, and it would signal that Ottawa wants to stay in the system while dialing back the depth of its dependence. The second thing to watch is whether Canada delays, pushing the final decision further into the future while it keeps its options open. Delay can be a strategy in itself, a way of buying time and leverage without slamming any doors shut. And the third thing to watch, the most dramatic of the possibilities, is whether Canada diversifies, choosing to bring in alternative aircraft from other suppliers so that it is no longer wholly reliant on a single American platform. Each of those paths would reverberate through the wider defense picture. And this is where the story stops being about one country and becomes a continental question. The Joint Air Defense Command that both nations rely on is built on the assumption of tight coordination and compatible equipment. Any move Canada makes toward a smaller, slower, or more mixed fleet feeds directly into how that command plans for the future. And then there is Golden Dome, the missile defense project I mentioned earlier. Canada's choices on the fighter jets are tangled up with its role in that shield because Washington has explicitly linked cooperation in one area to access in the other. So a Canadian decision to hedge on the fighters could ripple straight into its standing in Golden Dome, potentially reshaping how much of the future continental defense architecture Canada gets to help build, and how much it simply has to accept from the outside. And that brings me to the question that I think sits underneath this entire story, the one that everything else really comes down to. Would Canada actually be willing to loosen the deepest, oldest thread of its alliance with the United States, its reliance on its neighbor for the defense of its own skies? That reliance is not a recent arrangement. It is one of the most enduring features of the entire relationship, older and more deeply rooted than almost any other part of the partnership. For Canada to genuinely pull back from it would be a historic shift, the kind of move that gets studied for decades afterward. And yet, the mere fact that the question is now being asked out loud by a sitting Canadian government in the middle of an open dispute with Washington tells you that we have entered new territory.
Targeting computer inside has GPS, and it can track all the movement of the actual rifle. Once you have a target here, then you can actually hand off that.
I want to be careful not to overstate where things stand, because we are still in the middle of this, and nothing has been finally decided. Canada has not walked away from the F-35. The alliance has not collapsed.
Around the same time, Sterling Cross posted an image that shows close to 80 of these rifles, but it's not definitive.
Typically, they'll be marked with serial numbers so that if
the two countries are still, by any reasonable measure, among the closest partners in the world, bound together by geography, history, economics, and a shared interest in defending the same continent. What has changed is the confidence. The old certainty, the assumption that Canada would always defer, that the deal was as good as done, that the relationship would never really be questioned, that certainty is gone. And once that kind of certainty cracks, it does not easily reassemble itself. Even if Canada ultimately signs the full order tomorrow, the fact that it's seriously considered otherwise will linger in the minds of planners on both sides. Let me also draw out what this moment says about the broader direction of Carney's government, because I think the fighter jet dispute is really a window into a larger strategy. When a leader talks about reducing reliance on a powerful neighbor, it is easy to treat it as rhetoric, the kind of thing politicians say to sound independent. But rhetoric becomes real the moment it starts shaping actual decisions, and defense procurement is about as real as it gets. By allowing this review to happen, and by letting it become public, Carney's government is demonstrating that the pledge of reduced reliance is not confined to speeches about trade. It is a principle the government is willing to apply even in the sensitive, high-stakes world of military hardware, even at the risk of angering its most important ally. That is a meaningful signal, and Washington has clearly received it, which is exactly why the Pentagon's language has been so sharp. From the American side, I think there is a real worry that this is about more than one aircraft. If Canada is willing to reconsider the fighter jets, the deepest and most integrated part of the relationship, then Washington has to wonder what else might eventually be up for renegotiation. That is why the United States has moved to tie cooperation together across different areas, linking the fighter decision, the missile defense project, and the broader planning relationship into a single package. It is a way of raising the cost of Canadian independence, of making clear that pulling back in one place has consequences in others. Whether that pressure convinces Ottawa to fall back in line or instead hardens Canadian resolve to chart a more independent course is one of the most interesting open questions in this whole affair. There is a wider ripple effect here too that is worth naming, because Canada is not the only country watching how this plays out. Around the world, other buyers of American defense equipment are paying close attention to how Washington handles a partner that decides to push back. If the United States can pressure one of its closest and most loyal allies into falling into line by linking one program to another, that sends a message to every other government weighing a similar purchase. And if Canada manages to carve out more independence without paying an unbearable price, that sends a very different message. One that says even the tightest partnerships have room for a country to assert its own priorities. So in a quiet way, this dispute has become a kind of test case, watched by capitals far beyond North America, about how much leverage a supplier really holds over the customers who depend on it. That larger audience raises the stakes for both Ottawa and Washington, because neither wants to set a precedent that weakens its position in future dealings. There is also a purely practical dimension that I do not want to lose sight of amid all the strategy, and it comes down to time and aging equipment. Canada's current fighter fleet is not getting any younger. Every year of delay is a year in which the existing aircraft grow older, more expensive to keep flying, and less capable against modern threats. So while there is a strong case for taking the time to get this decision right, there is an equally strong case that the country cannot afford to deliberate forever. At some point, a choice has to be made, because the physical reality of an aging fleet does not wait for the politics to resolve itself. That ticking clock is part of what makes this situation so tense. Ottawa is trying to preserve its options and its independence, but the clock keeps running, and the longer it runs, the fewer good choices may remain. When I step back and try to summarize what is really at stake, it comes down to this. Canada is standing at a genuine crossroads in its defense relationship with the United States. Down one path lies the familiar arrangement, the full F-35 order, deep integration, and the comfortable, well-worn dependence that has defined continental defense for generations, along with a secure place inside projects like Golden Dome. Down the other path lies something newer and more uncertain, a Canada that trims, delays, or diversifies, that accepts more cost and complexity in exchange for greater control over its own security, and that risks friction with Washington in pursuit of independence. Neither path is easy, neither is free of serious risk, and the choice belongs entirely to Ottawa, even as the Pentagon does everything it can to influence which way the decision falls. What makes this such a compelling story to follow is that it is not really about a plane. It is about power, trust, and the question of how much one country is willing to depend on another for its most vital needs. The F-35 is simply the vehicle through which that much larger question is being fought out. And the way Canada answers it will tell us a great deal about the future of the alliance, about the limits of Carney's push for independence, and about whether the deepest bonds between these two neighbors are as unbreakable as everyone once assumed. For now, the review continues, the pressure from Washington continues, and the fundamental question hangs in the air, unresolved and impossible to ignore. I will be following every twist of this closely because the coming decisions will shape not just Canada's Air Force, but the entire structure of North American defense for years to come. Whether Canada holds firm, pulls back, or finds some middle ground, the choice will echo far beyond the borders of either country, and it will redefine what partnership between these two neighbors actually means in a more uncertain era. This is one of those stories where the outcome is truly not written yet, and that is exactly what makes it worth watching. Thank you so much for watching my coverage of Canada rethinking its F-35 deal and the growing tension with the United States. If you found this breakdown useful, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so that you never miss the next development in this story or any of the other important news I cover. Your support means a great deal, and it helps me keep bringing you clear, in-depth reporting on the events that shape our world. I will see you in the next one.